Okay, so we're going to start chapter 6. This chapter is on conditioning and learning. We're going to be talking specifically about two different types of conditioning and one major form of learning. So, when we go out into our environment, we have to learn from that environment in order to be more adaptable and more successful to changing conditions. So we're going to be talking about how our body actually responds to stimuli, and then again, the different types of learning that make us more successful. These all start with our basic reflexes. These are our inevitable and involuntary responses to stimuli. We've talked about reflexes back in chapter 3. We talked about infant reflexes, but we as adults also have reflexes. So if someone knocks on the door, you're going to turn your head, you're going to orient towards that, and that is a reflex. It's an orientation reflex. If someone throws something at your face, you're going to flinch and close your eyes. That's a reflex to protect your face and your eyes. Bright light, same thing. You're going to blink your eyes, and that's again to shield that sensitive organ. So our reflexes help us do our basic bodily responses, and as scientists, people have actually been able to harness our reflexes to kind of modify when they're expressed, and we're going to be talking about that when we get to our first major section. Learning in general is this relatively permanent change in behavior or the capacity for behavior that occurs due to experience. And experience can be learning in a karate class, learning in a classroom. It could be learning how to cook by watching your parents. But it's also things like learning how to walk and through experience and watching other people. It can be learning how to speak by listening to others and watching them speak. We also, like we talked about the space rats, we can learn from low-level features of our environment, including gravity, oxygen level, temperature, and things like that. So learning is a really broad term. It doesn't just mean we're talking about classroom learning. And when we're talking about types of learning, we're going to be talking about associative learning and cognitive learning. The first two sections of this chapter on conditioning are actually different types of associative learning. This is when we learn by the formation of simple associations between stimuli and responses. So things that happen in the environment and how our body responds to it. And then cognitive learning is this higher level learning involving thinking, knowing, understanding, and anticipation. So this is like when our brain is more actively involved, like we're consciously aware of what's actually happening, and we're maybe trying to figure something out and to learn from the environment. When we're talking about these types of learning, we're going to be considering antecedents and consequences. So antecedents are events that precede a response, and consequences are the effects that follow a response. So an antecedent could be studying a lot, and the consequence would be getting a better grade. An antecedent could be walking up to a drunk guy in a bar and insulting him, and the consequence would be being punched in the face. So antecedents and consequences happen throughout our lives, and we don't always even recognize when these things are occurring, but they're just natural responses that happen within our environment. Associative learning is a type of learning that we're going to be focusing on first. Again, this occurs when we form new connections among stimuli and or our behaviors. And there's two types of associative learning that we're going to be focusing on. And these include classical conditioning and operant conditioning. Classical conditioning, we're going to start with first, is a form of learning in which we have reflex responses that are associated with new stimuli. So these are really low-level responses. We're actually going to be able to manipulate our responses, our reflex responses, animals' responses, and other people in our environment's responses. We also are going to be talking about operant conditioning. This is learning based on the consequences of responding, and this is something that we're actually more consciously aware of, and we would voluntarily do that response. It's not a reflex that just happens naturally. And then at the very end of this chapter, we're going to be talking about observational learning, and this is when an organism learns by modeling the actions of another. So learning how to dance by watching your dance instructor, that would be observational learning. You have to observe in order to learn. So if you're in class, we're going to be doing a experiment about classical conditioning, but obviously I can't do that via video, so I'm very sorry. So we're going to start off talking about classical conditioning. So this man here in the picture with the big white beard, this is a guy named Ivan Pavlov. Perhaps his name rings a bell to you? Okay, you don't get the joke yet, but you're about to. Okay, so Ivan Pavlov was a Russian scientist. He was actually a physiologist, which means he studied how the body essentially did its biological mechanisms in order to be, alive. He specifically studied digestion, and he studied things like stomach acid. He actually won a Nobel Prize for the discovery of stomach acid and the role that it plays in digestion. So, a very, very successful, smart man. Um, he did a lot of his experiments with dogs, which you see here in the picture. And one of the things that he became curious about was salivation. So he had seen, the juices in our stomach, the stomach acid that helps break down food. And he's like, okay, well, we all produce saliva. Dogs produce a lot of saliva. We humans produce saliva. That has to play some important role in digestion. So let me explore this. So he set up an experiment where he put these little like tubes off the dog's salivary glands on their mouth. And so anytime he fed them, when they salivated, instead of it going into their mouth, it would collect in the tubes, and he can measure how much saliva they produce. Obviously, we can't really do this with humans, so he used dogs as a stand-in. And so every day he would bring them like meat powder. I guess that was what they enjoyed. And so he'd give them the meat powder, and then the saliva would fill up the tubes. He'd measure it and do his studies. But after a few days of this, he realized that the tubes began to fill up with saliva before he actually gave him the meat powder. Pretty much as soon as he walked into the kennels, they would begin to salivate. And he's like, what the heck is going on? Like, how is this reflex, this salivary response, occurring before food is there? Like, it's supposed to happen with food. Why is it happening before the food is present? So then he came with this idea of psychic glands. Like, our glands in our body are psychic, they can predict the future. And then he realized that was kind of silly. So he started doing some experiments to see if he could kind of manipulate and harness this reflex response to demonstrate a simple form of learning, which is what he did. So here's his experiment that he did. So before conditioning, if you give food to a dog, it's going to salivate. And so the food is what we call our unconditioned stimulus. It's the thing in the environment, the stimulus, that produces a natural response. And their natural response is salivation. That's our unconditioned response. So before anything happens, before any learning or conditioning occurs, food is going to produce salivation. So the unconditioned stimulus causes the unconditioned response. He also then used a neutral stimulus, so something in the environment that the dogs wouldn't naturally respond with salivation to. So in this case, he used a metronome. In other experiments, he used the bell. So you'll see that a lot of times in different materials. So the metronome, if you've never seen a metronome, it's like a little thing that clicks to help keep time for musicians. So it's a kind of sound. And this metronome is a neutral stimulus, and the dog kind of looks at it and doesn't produce a response, so there's no response occurring. Then, as the training part of the experiment, every time he presented the food to the dogs, he also presented them with the metronome. So they would hear and see the metronome when they were receiving food. Of course, the food is producing this unconditioned response of salivation because the dog's hungry. He's going to eat the food. After several times of pairing the food with the metronome, he would remove the food and only play the metronome, and the dogs would salivate. So essentially, they had learned that this metronome means that food should be coming. So what was a neutral stimulus before has now become our conditioned stimulus, and what was an unconditioned response is now our conditioned response. It's a natural response that's been harnessed by the presence of this metronome that had been paired with food over time. So I want you to actually go into the videos and the playlist. There's one example from The Office where Jim conditions Dwight. And I want you to go through and I want you to try to figure out what's your unconditioned stimulus, what's your unconditioned response, what's your neutral stimulus, what's your conditioned stimulus, and what's your conditioned response. I want you to do that for this video to make sure you understand it. So go ahead and watch that. Here again are all the conditioning terms, their abbreviations that are used in the literature, and then the definition if you'd like to take a closer look at that. This comes from our textbooks. You can always take a look at that as well. Now, the contingency and contiguity of the learning can alter how quickly and how successfully durable that learning can be. So if you pair the bell or the metronome every single time you give the food, learning is going to happen very rapidly. But if you have less contiguity, or sorry, you have contiguity but less contingency, you're going to reduce learning. It's going to take longer for them to learn. So what that means is that like maybe every other time you present the food, you present the bell. It's going to take longer for that dog to learn that pairing if you only do it every once in a while. Now you may have seen this with your own pets at home, that you maybe you open a certain drawer, or if you open a can or something, they will maybe learn pretty quickly that, oh, the can opener means my food's coming. But you don't always use a can opener to open their food. You may open a can of beans or tuna or whatever it might be, and they will still learn that association, just maybe won't happen quite as quickly than if it was every single time. But the thing is that if you do it only every other time or every fifth time, the learning is going to be more durable. It's going to take a longer time to get rid of that, which is why if you stop feeding your dog the canned food, they're still going to be listening for that can opener for many, many months, if not years, after you've stopped using the can opener for their food. So expectancy is an anticipation concerning future events or relationships. So essentially, the reflexes are anticipating that presence of food, or that that otherwise unconditioned stimulus. So this part right here is unconditioned stimulus of the food over here. Extinction is the weakening of a conditioned response through the removal of reinforcement. So over time, if the unconditioned stimulus stops following the conditioned stimulus, conditioning will fade away. So if you stop presenting food after showing the dogs a metronome, they're eventually going to learn, oh, I guess the metronome doesn't mean anything anymore, and they're going to stop salivating in response. Again, if you stop using a can opener to open your dog's food and the can opener never results in them getting food anymore, they're going to stop responding to the sound of the can opener. But what can happen is what's called spontaneous recovery. This is the reappearance of a learned response after its apparent extinction. So after a period of time, maybe the next day, you will see the response that's similar to the very first day. So here's kind of an example of this. So again, you may have stopped feeding your dog canned food for a week or so, but then all of a sudden the next day, it just starts responding like you had never stopped giving it canned food. And here's kind of a graph of this. And so the first day, it's a very high response, but if you continually present that stimuli over and over again, eventually it's going to fade away throughout the day. So over eight instances, it's faded to almost no response. But then the next day, it's high again, but then it only takes maybe 4 to get down, and then the next day again, it'll be a little bit lower, about half, and then it quickly drops off. So it may take several days, several weeks, or even several months to truly extinguish a response when it comes to conditioning. So extinction, again, is learned behaviors stop when they're no longer followed by a reinforcing consequence. If you've ever seen a child at the grocery store throw a fit because mom said that they wouldn't get them something, chances are they are responding this way because the last time they threw a fit, they got the response they were looking for. So mom maybe reinforced the behavior by giving in and getting them a candy bar or a toy at the grocery store. And now you're going to have to break that behavior, and that's the process of extinction, where every single time you say no until that behavior goes away completely. This response, a conditioned response, can actually happen to us in one trial, and this occurs when we have what's called a taste aversion based off a negative experience. So, for an example, if you go out and say you've never had oysters before, like you see in the picture, and you go out and you have oysters, and then later that night you get really sick and you end up throwing up, you're probably never going to want to eat oysters again. You've essentially had this negative association created between eating oysters and getting sick that night. But it may not have even been the oysters that caused the problem. It could have been maybe the fish you ate with it, or your salad or something else that could have caused a response. But because the oysters were new and maybe something you were a little squeamish about beforehand, you're gonna associate that feeling of sickness with the oysters. Now, the interesting thing is that taste aversion is very situationally dependent. Typically, it's something that's new or something that you were kind of hesitant to eat in the first place. But imagine you got sick after eating at your favorite pizza place. So you get your favorite pizza, you eat a whole bunch, and then that night you get really sick. Are you likely to go back and eat pizza again? Probably. It may take you a few weeks or a few months before you want to eat pizza again. You may not want to go back to the same place, or you may not eat the same type. So if you got meat lovers, maybe be avoiding, a sausage pizza or something. But typically, you'll go back because you have a wealth of experience with that thing. It's when things are really novel that we're more likely to avoid them permanently. Now, this is, a survival thing. Imagine our ancestors who went to a new place and they're like, oh, what's this food? Let me try to eat this berry. And they eat the berry and they get sick. They learn not to eat that berry, even if it really wasn't the berry that caused the problem. You want to make sure that you're not exposing yourself to something that's poisonous or dangerous to your health. This can actually be applied to help people who have alcohol dependency issues. So, people who are trying to abstain from alcohol can actually take a drug that's called Antabuse that conditions a taste aversion to alcohol. So, the drug produces severe nausea if they have just one sip of alcohol. So, people who otherwise would want to drink a whole lot, they drink just a little bit, they get really sick, and they learn to associate alcohol with feeling nauseous, and so they then learn to avoid alcohol altogether. And this is a really new, novel approach. It's still not super widely accepted, but it is very successful if used correctly. From what I've heard, I think it's a pill you can take, but there might be an injectable, longer-lasting form of that. So people just have to kind of make sure that they're getting access to that medication regularly. Another interesting study is the one. It's a classic study called the Little Albert Experiment. Now, a group of researchers, and this is right before the time of Ivan Pavlov, they were interested to see if fear was something that was natural in a child or if it was something that could be learned and created in a child. So what they did is John Watson and Rosalie Rayner, they published in 1920, so a long time ago before all our ethical standards were in place. They were interested in seeing emotional reactions, if they could be conditioned or not. And so they found a baby, a 9-month-old little child named Albert B. And so they nicknamed him Little Albert. And what they did is they showed Albert a series of little small animals, including white rats, rabbits, monkeys, masks, things like that. And he showed no fear. He, naturally curious little children, they're not afraid of these things. But then what Watson did is he got a big metal pipe and a hammer, and every time little Albert reached for the rat, he would hit the metal pipe with the hammer really loudly, which would scare Albert and make him cry. After several associations or pairings of the noise with the rat, Albert would cry just seeing the rat, and he would actually no longer approach it. He would be terrified of this little white rat, and he extended it to other white furry things. So if he was afraid of the white rat, he was also then afraid of the white rabbit, white stuffed animals, white beards. He was just terrified. Now, no one really knows who little Albert was. There's been a lot of research to try to determine who that child ended up being and what the long-term consequences of it were. There's a joke, there's like this 90-year-old man going around who's or 100-year-old man who's terrified of white rats and beards and things like that. They believe that the little Albert was actually the son of one of the nurses who worked in the hospital. And that when she saw what was happening, she got really pissed off and she took her kid out of the experiment before they could decondition the fear. But we believe that little Albert was a child who actually then died, I think of like measles or something, when he was like 12 or 13. So sad all around story. But it did show that we could actually condition fear into individuals and other emotional reactions. So if you're trying to overcome a fear, though, we can actually use the process of classical conditioning to help people. There's two major forms of this help. We have what's called flooding and what's called systematic desensitization. So flooding is treating a phobia by exposing the person to the fear-producing stimuli in a manner that is safe, but until they no longer respond. So they have what's called extinction again, but this is really traumatic. So for an example, if you're afraid of spiders, with flooding, what we would do is we would put you in like a fear factor style situation where maybe you're like laying in a clear box and we pour spiders all over you, and you're going to go into a huge fear response. You're going to be freaking out, you're going to be breathing hard, your sympathetic nervous system is going to go into overdrive. But the thing is that your sympathetic nervous system can't produce these fear responses for very long and eventually becomes exhausted. And once you've exhausted that fear and it's gone away, you're going to be calmer and you're going to realize that that thing is no longer a threat. So you're no longer going to be afraid of spiders because you push through it. But obviously, this is highly traumatic. And it's very, very difficult to do. It just feels terrible. And it sometimes doesn't work, and it actually produces an even stronger fear response. So think of like little kids who are afraid of the water, and their parents push them into the pool, and they have to sink or swim, quite literally. This can produce a greater fear of water and also a fear of the person who pushed them. So like it could disrupt their emotional bond with their parents or trust in strangers if it was another person who did it. A more calm version of this is what's called systematic desensitization. So associations between the phobic stimulus and the fear are then replaced by associations between the phobic stimulus and relaxation. What they do is they have an introduction to the stimulus that starts off small and increases in intensity. So if we go back to our spider example, first maybe you would see a cartoon picture of a spider, and then you would learn, you look at that, maybe feel a little fearful, and you would do a relaxation, maybe breathing technique, happy place kind of thing until you're okay with the cartoon spider. And then maybe you would see a picture of a little bit more realistic spider. And then maybe you'd see a picture of a real spider. And then maybe a video of a real spider. Then maybe you would see a plastic spider, hold the plastic spider. Eventually there'd be maybe a spider in a box across the room, and then bring it closer and closer to you until the spider could actually be on your hand. And you have to go very slowly, go step by step, and then increase the intensity. But if at any point the relaxation falters and the person gets too freaked out, they go back to an earlier stage of exposure to the less fear-inducing step, and then they wait until they can relax, and then they increase it again. This can be used for a whole bunch of different things. Fear of flying. They'll do virtual reality simulations of flying to help a person feel more calm and relaxed. They'll do this for fear of heights and a whole bunch of other different things. There are a couple videos on the playlist. There's one from The Big Bang Theory where Sheldon is given a compulsive closure therapy from his girlfriend Amy. That's kind of a mix between flooding and systematic desensitization. She doesn't push him so far that he has a full like panic response, but it's not systematic desensitization because she doesn't make sure he's okay after each one and calm. So that's kind of an in between. It's a pop media version. There's also some primal fear videos where they show people trying to overcome their fears of different things. So you should check those things out. It's kind of interesting. We can also be conditioned indirectly. So if you watch someone else get shocked after hearing a tone, you will also develop the conditioned response of like jumping back to that tone. So vicarious classical conditioning is any classical conditioning brought about by observing another person react to a particular stimulus. So for example, a child could become fearful of snakes after watching their mom show fear towards snakes. It's actually how a lot of children develop their fears. You could develop a taste aversion by watching someone else get sick after eating something. So we can get vicarious classical conditioning to foods, political parties, ethnic groups, and even silly things like escalators or airplanes and things like that. So it doesn't have to happen directly to you. You can actually learn from other people and have this reflex response of fear or aversion to these things, even though you never experienced the negative effect yourself. All right, so we're going to stop here, and next we're going to be starting on operant conditioning.